Start the recording. All right, and I should have. All right, hello everyone. I'm back from the dead, so to speak, and I'm here to talk about a fun little design topic with a very special guest. I'm going to have that special guest introduce himself right here. Say hello, Safer.
Hello. Hi.
Okay.
My name is Safer. I am a board game design developer, and for Null Signal Games, I do both development lead stuff alongside Dave, and then also help coordinate and lead the standard format team that is responsible for standard bans.
Yeah, and we've gotten to chat a lot through playtesting and other work at NSG, and you had been talking about this concept that's been really kind of helping you, this idea of a flat game state that's been helping you guide some of your thinking about design work, and you wanted to kind of get it out in the community. And I said, well, I haven't made a video in a long time. Let's get this show on the road, so to speak. So the title of the video is Flat Game State. I mentioned it the first. Let's kind of talk about what the flat game state is and a little bit about kind of where the theory of it comes from too.
Yeah, so this kind of concept of flat game state actually came from a playtester. Peter H. was doing a lot of playtesting actually during both the Borealis cycle as well as like the Liberation cycle. And from some of the lessons that we learned from testing Borealis and then seeing what happened once it was released into the wild, Peter kind of came up with this concept and shared it with me. And then after that, it's kind of been really hard to not see certain things in this light. So what is flat game state? Well, it is a game state where the corp has no actions that they can take that prevent the runner from using their actions to steal agendas and win the game. And this is kind of a core component of Netrunner's game systems, which we'll kind of explain and get into with some examples.
Yeah, so the thesis of this video is that actually fundamentally Netrunner as a game system has this problem where it is by default this flat game state where without card effects, the corp always loses. And so that's the kind of what we kind of mean by this flat game state where the corp can't take meaningful actions to prevent themselves from losing. And so the cards then have to be the forces that work against this baseline system. So corp cards have to resist this, but then to some extent, runner cards are always going to try and funnel you back towards this baseline system, right? If there's the version of the game for the runner where they get to access every single card and the corp can take meaningful actions, that's obviously the best possible state. So a lot of runner cards kind of can, when this by their design, push back towards these sort of systems. So Netrunners, both these cards have to create these forces, and then because it's a card game, we need these having these different card types that matter, and that when you draw them, like these all contribute to Netrunner's variety, replayability, like part of why we all love it so much. But I think one of the things that this video is trying to also say is like ice and icebreakers are the most important dynamic for resisting that flat game state, and like. There's a lot of debates that we'll have of like, assets being a major part of the game, or this really good thing to add. But when a lot of people think about core Netrunner, they don't think about the assets and the upgrades. They think about the ice and the icebreakers. And one of the theses of this video is that that's actually kind of correct. That should generally be one of the core focuses on how the game is designed to resist the kind of flat game state. Though maybe I've run over some of your points here, Safer, so I'll let you
You're good.
Jump on in.
Yeah, I want to drill a little bit more into the third point here, because Netrunner, like all kind of card games, have different card types, and they have different kind of meanings in their own ways. We can kind of think of the primary four different runner card types, and how programs, hardwares, and resources, they're all only different types in the sense of like their meanings aren't like built into the core game rule systems. It's that, you can expect a program to do X, Y, or Z. You can expect a resource to do X, Y, or Z. But ice and icebreakers in particular are like the things that change flat game state more than any other card type. And that's one of the reasons why, when you play either a lower power format, or when the card pool's on the smaller side, you start to see things like ice and icebreakers and credits being incredibly important and like the core part of the game. A normal Netrunner game, you can kind of think about the progression of the very beginning of the game is a flat game state. And then as players draw their cards, the corp finds ice to lock out the runner. And then the game becomes the runner finding some combinations of keys to deal with those locks. And that is where, you have fractors interacting with barriers, you have sentries interacting with killers, and you have like this variety of keys and locks that allows you to get into some things, but not necessarily all things. And then eventually, in the very end of the game, what happens is the runner has found all of their keys for all of the corpse locks, but there's some sort of resources that is gating them from literally checking every single server. So this is like kind of what the progression looks like, and why the draw order within the game design of Netrunner makes all of the games feel so different and varied, because the runner's reach is based off of what tools have the corp found at that point in the game and what tools have the runner found at that point in the game. So let's start off, I think, with point number one, because we've talked a little bit about flat game state. But now I think that we need to showcase exactly why flat game state favors the runner.
Yeah.
You have the basic action card and you have the basic actions that are available to you. And we can do a thought experiment where the runner has no cards in their deck and the corporation only has agendas.
And in that hypothetical state, right, the corp has 3 actions that they can take. Even if their deck is entirely 2-1 agendas, they can go install, advance, score. The runner still has the click advantage and can just run repeatedly until they will get to 7 points before the corp does. And I think even if you take this to an extreme where the corp has exclusively 0 advancement cost agendas, the runner still gets to 7 first under most reasonable permutations of agendas. And so the game necessitates some other card type to give the corp the opportunity to win with the base rule set of corp has 3 clicks, runner has 4. And so we can go on to the next hypothetical where the corp deck is just agendas and ice, and the runner's deck is only icebreakers that match that ice type.
So when let's say the corporation installs an agenda for their first click, installs a piece of ice for their next click that has the end the run subroutine on it. Now, no matter how many clicks the runner has, because their deck is empty, they cannot touch the agenda that's behind the ice. Now, the corporation in theory would need 2 pieces of ice, one for a central server and one to protect the remote server that allows them to score out on the future turn. But the end of the run ice is the dynamic that asks the runner to go find specific cards in their deck to now be able to touch cards again.
So let's say, in this hypothetical example, the runner has found their icebreaker and now they have to spend resources. And in this particular game state with a single end the run ice that has a 3 strength and a 1 strength rising tide, it costs the runner 3 credits to go in and check the card that goes into that remote server. So if the remote server is just the 1 ice and the 1 agenda, now the runner can still always win. But we start to see that, what if we have more than 1 ice? Well, now the runner can't check every turn. Or what if we have multiple remote servers with agendas behind them protected by ice? Now the runner has to start picking and choosing where they're going to go for accesses. And this is now, we start to have less of a completely solved game, and you start to actually have some variety in decisions and things that can be made by both sides. And this, is like the core gameplay loop almost of Netrunner is this interaction between the locks and keys, and then the resources to spend the keys to then break the locks.
Exactly. So, with a single Maskarovka, it costs Rising Tide 3 credits to break the end of the run, which means that with 4 clicks, the runner could spend 3 of those clicks in a single turn to gain the credits, and then the last click to run, break the Maskarovka, and access the agenda. That means that the corp would not be able to score out any agendas, even if their server centrals could not be run from the runner side. So in that state, the runner still wins. And then what happens is, as more ice comes onto the board and the servers become harder to do, like to get into, that is when the runner cannot just spend a single turn to get the resources that they need to access every card that the corporation puts down.
One interesting thing about the system is it relies on the runner's resources being finite. And so you can imagine, the hypothetical game where the corp and the runner both have infinite amounts of money. The runner, if this is the board state, the runner still always wins, right? Because it does not matter how many ice the corp has. And like even in this example, like the runner is not punished for giving the corp 2 credits on each of these subroutines. The only thing that matters is the end of the run. And so this is like the other way. So like one way to get, this is sort of the like, the flat game state can emerge in this hypothetical where the corp has no defenses, but then there's also the way that it reemerges, which is the runner's resources so overpower the corp's or overpower the resource hurdles that the corp can present that we kind of return to that flat game state from kind of the other side to some extent.
And you may be familiar with like the phrase or the concept of, the just getting money from the corporation side doesn't win the game. Whereas runners that have basically infinite money, it does allow them to win the game. And the entire point is that, runners with infinite economy reduces the game to flat game state. Whereas when the corp has infinite money and they can res all of their ice, it doesn't inherently mean that the runner can't still win the game.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's also, we can now start talking about, assets and upgrades and kind of what that looks like. So here's another example of, okay, what if, there's some decks out there that are called asset spam and run little or no ice. And do those decks work in this kind of concept of flat game state? And we can take another example and look at that. So imagine that the corporation deck is filled with exclusively Nico campaigns and off-world offices. Who wins the game? Well, the runner, the corporation can install 3 cards during their turn. The runner can run 4 servers during their turn. So they can check every single card that the corporation puts down. So the corporation cannot win the game. It is not possible. If we then change those Nico campaigns, which are just credits, to auto campaigns, a different kind of effect, then who wins the game? And the answer is still the runner most of the times, because the runner can check all of kind of the face down cards. And what becomes important then is the runner's economy for being able to pay the 2 trash costs of auto campaign to stop its effect from going through. Because auto campaign, notably, will allow the corp to spend their entire turn to score out a 4-2 agenda. So that would be an actual way of bypassing the fact that the runner could check every single server. Now, just like with ICE, the way that asset spam gets around flat game state is through an economic tax and making the runner's economy matter, so that the runner has to spend clicks gaining money or drawing cards or doing some form of other resource gathering to then interact with the cards that are on the table.
Yeah, I think one thing that's notably distinct about this from the ice board state, right, with the ice, because we have multiple subtypes, the resources the runner spends can be variable because you can beat ice in many different ways, but they're also kind of lock and key, so you have to find multiple of them potentially. Comparison to assets is it really boils back down to if the corp has an infinite number of auto campaigns, if the runner can spend 3 clicks trashing them and then make 6 credits in the click, they'll always win the game. And if they can't, they will eventually lose. And so it just make the agendas and assets only version of Netrunner becomes just about how efficiently you can make credit totals go up. And so I think that's part of why ICE is maybe a tool that is maybe a little bit more favored for breaking that flat game state, because you can have more dynamics, because it has beyond just the credit generating resource sink, you have this additional lock and key dynamic that you get to kind of weave into it.
Exactly. And both of these still result in the best versions of Netrunners when you have a variety of different card effects. Both ICE and assets and these different strategies still result in an economic-based game, and that's when Netrunner is the most fun. But I think that this is a really great example illustrating what changes flat game state and what doesn't actually change flat game state. Because if we kind of think back to our 4 different phases, right, the ICE dynamic has kind of 4 different steps before the flat game state is completely turned into an economy matters kind of position in the game. Whereas in the asset version, that is the only dynamic that is played right from the beginning, right from turn 1. And that is part of the reason why against asset spam lists, cards like Azamat or cards like Fencer Fuenu or cards like Clean Getaway, which are just economy cards, are considered to be asset tech, because that is what the corp is basically asking of the runner, right? All right, so we've now talked about kind of the different corp cards, the different types of corp cards, and also even what asset tech looks like. And, all of these things end up boiling down to a game of economy. And what that means is that on the runner's side, their economy is basically what determines if a game reaches flat game state again by the end of the game or not. So we can now look at how do we evaluate specifically icebreakers, because we know that the end the run subroutine is the primary way that the corp breaks flat game state. So let's look at a little bit of the runner tools and see how do those interact with the ice. So there's kind of 3 main dynamics because of the stats of icebreakers and how they work that determines how powerful they are. So the first thing is scope. How many servers and or ice types does the tool work against? How many locks can this key actually be used against?
Yeah.
Right. The second thing is strength, right? Ice has stats on it, and the strength is usually one of the things that determines if how effectively a key can be used to deal with that lock. And the third and final thing is, of course, the actual resource requirement that you need to put into using that key. Because, of course, the corporation uses their credits to activate a lock a single time throughout the game, and then every single time the runner needs to break the lock, they need to pay some sort of resource or credit requirement. So we can now take a look at different icebreakers or faker tools to see how they interact with some of these dynamics.
Yeah, so we're going to start actually by looking at a bunch of the cards that have ended up on the standard ban list. So first up we have Cleaver, and this is a card that some people were guessing was going to get banned, but some people were saying, felt like, oh no, this is just a standard breaker, right? And so when we look at the 3 kind of ways of evaluating icebreaker strength, it starts, I think it becomes a useful lens to look at how we can evaluate this. So the scope of Cleaver, it is limited to just barriers. That's completely normal. The normative icebreaker has a single icebreaker type it can break, right? But the thing that probably pushed Cleaver the most, or one of the two things that really pushed Cleaver over the edge, is basically it made every barrier with strength less than 4 equivalent. And then even for those barriers that were strength 4 or greater, it was hard to find a tool that was more efficient than Cleaver, and it kind of flattened everything back down in terms of that element of ice strength. And then, yeah, as we talked about, like the resource cost to use this for the runner, it's a one-time install, and then it's basically 1 credit to break just about any ice, which is very, that means for every ice you want to run through, you need to spend 1 click as the highest level, the most amount of resources you'll ever need to break a barrier. And that ends up being pretty warping to the format of barrier spaces and kind of design space.
Yeah. And so Cleaver, while a incredibly strong card, was primarily banned not just because of his strength, but also because of how constricting it made the barrier space. We talked about how end the run is the most important subroutine for preventing flat game state. And so as a result, even though Cleaver's scope is limited to barriers, its scope was limited to the things that were the most important for the corp resisting flat game state. And then the fact that the credit cost was so low, and barriers and their what the impact of barriers is so constricted to end the run that Cleaver made it just basically really, really hard to print a variety of barriers in the game.
Yeah.
And actually make those economic choices from the runner side matter.
Yeah. So we have another recent joiner from the Anarch card pool to the ban list, and Banhart. And this is a little bit different, right? This is our card that really has this pretty wild scope comparison, right? So Cleaver, we just talked about, that only breaks barriers. It can't break all barriers. Banhart could break or fake its way through any ice by as long as it was the outermost on the server. And so for the corp to actually stop the runner from getting in to any of the R&D HQ and a scoring remote, for example, they would need 6 pieces of ice to fully defend themselves. That is a long time that the runner has to assemble other tools. They can combo with ice destruction tools or other ice mitigation tools. That really kind of meant that this was a one-stop shop that prevented the corp from creating locks that were meaningful. And so that second phase where the corp finds locks, the runner found this one tool that opens all the doors, and then by the time the corp maybe is able to reestablish those locks, the runner's had plenty of time to get to that final bullet point where they've just accumulated a bunch of resources and can run over the game. And so for Banhart, that scope is very wide. Its strength, the ice doesn't matter. The only thing that matters on the ice is its number of subroutines. And then for cost, in general, if you're paying, if an ice has 2 subroutines, you're probably paying more than 2 credits with most breakers to break it. So exchanging those credits for card draw, even though cards are often more valuable than credits, you're making the savings by not having to worry about the ice's strength. And so this often came out to be cheaper, and in the Anarch card pool especially, beneficial to lose cards from your hands at time.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that your point on subroutines and the cost is very impactful here. We brought this one up as a example of making strength relevant, because typically ice has more strength than it does numbers of subroutines. And so Bankar made it so that ice strength didn't really matter. The number of subroutines is what's mattered. But usually the corp was paying for the ice, the ice's res cost, in part because of the strength. And that meant that Bankar could extend that first phase of the game for a really long time. So the game starts at flat game state. Bankar, once you've installed it, basically says, we are still in the first phase of the game. Yes, you may have found some of your locks, but you need to keep finding even more locks. And then, of course, by the end of the game, where we're in stage 4, where the runner has found all of their tools to deal with all of the corpse locks, Bankar continued to be useful because it's usually very resource efficient.
All right. So next up on the band ice faker kind of tools list, we have Turbine. Now, Turbine arguably isn't an ice faker, but it had some really large impacts on the game and on the economy. And so by these same 3 criteria, we can kind of look at and how it warps everything else. So for scope, I think Turbine is sort of an interesting one where it applies to every non-AI icebreaker. This is a very good effect, right? This is a global boost to everything. And I think it's, but it's not a tool. It's not a key on its own, right? It's kind of an economy piece in a different way than all of the other cards we've talked about, which I think gives it a little bit of a different texture. Though in practice, I think was just as important for getting back to a flat game state in the almost the opposite side of Banhart, right? Banhart got to the flat game state because it said, oh yeah, the early game where it's flat, it's going to stay that way forever. And that middle steps 2 and 3 are going to be extremely narrow. Turbine kind of goes in the opposite direction where once you get to that state 4 where all the breakers are down, there's the corp loses their ability to leverage an economic kind of game for the runner. In terms of its strength, go ahead.
Very good. Part of our premise is that once the ice and icebreakers come out and we're in that 4th stage of the game, that the game becomes like a game of economy. And K2CP Turbine here basically says, no, once we've hit that 4th stage of the game, it is a flat game state rather than being a game state that cares about my economy. So there was some amount of setup that was required. There's some amount of like credit investment from that. But in our examples where we had Rising Tide, getting through a Maskarovka for 3 credits and effectively saying like, I can check every server every single turn. Not every single server. I can check your ICE server every single turn if I just only need to pay 3 credits into it. K2P. Oh, I'm going to get this wrong so many times. Turbine says that I can get into any of your servers for minimal credits independent of the number of ICE or what their strength is. And that's what kind of took Turbine over the edge.
Yeah. So it's, that all makes sense. So we have one final Borealis card to talk about. And those of you in the know probably have been waiting for us to talk about this one. This is Endurance. This is probably the strongest faker tool ever printed. Maybe some people will argue Faust, but I think this Endurance kind of blows Faust out of the water in practice. So when we think about those 3 factors of scope, Endurance can be used on any ice, any number of times in a single turn. It is entirely agnostic to the strength of the ice, and once the Endurance is on the board, it costs the runner nothing to use it. And so it just had this effect where, in theory, it had some rate limit on how often you could use it, but in practice, it was, hey, if the cheapest I can break your most expensive ice on the board is free, you have to come up with a way to make me have to do that multiple times in a short compression to even make me have to worry about having other cards installed. There's Endurance is a class of its own in these sort of ice faker tools.
Yeah, as someone who didn't get to experience Endurance because I was out of the game during that time period, I looked at Endurance afterwards and was like, okay, it looks strong, but I don't understand. Like, I hear all of these stories about how Endurance Boat is one of the most warping cards that Netrunner has seen in recent history. And then when we look at, the flat game state and this kind of theory, and we look at the different kind of attributes that can be used to invalidate ice, and Endurance has every single one of them, it starts to make sense. You start to see what the warping effect of Endurance would have on a format, and the fact that Endurance was played, I believe, sometimes as the entirety of the influence in some Anarch lists, right? Just goes to show that when a runner can get to can basically for a flat game state by invalidating end the run ice, that it is incredibly potent and a very good way of winning the game. And that that is because of the core kind of systems in Netrunner. So endurance is the kind of effect I think that we all understand is like not okay to have in the game. It's not healthy for the game. It doesn't make the game better. And this is, I think, a really great framework for basically understanding why.
Yeah, I think that's the neat thing to me when you start talking to me about this is like, this is almost the theory about why these cards kind of deserve to be on the ban list, and why some of the other cards we're going to talk about next that aren't on the ban list maybe could fall on one side or the other, but why, for the moment at least, they are on the side of probably still being okay. And so, like, the first one might be like, hey, we just talked about Cleaver being over the line, it's too efficient. Buzzsaw's right there, right? So is Buzzsaw going to fall afoul of the same thing? And I think to some extent the answer is it may eventually, right? Because it is going to have a similar compressing thing for if it becomes the most common decoder. It compresses all code gates into below 3 strength and above 3 strength. Now, I think in practice there might be a couple of mitigating things. One is 3 to boost instead of 2 to boost ends up being an enormous difference, right? It means that if you do get that 4 strength code gate, it is just much more taxing, and so other decoders have a chance to be best in slot tools, which then actually allows the other strength of code gates to have some room because they might exploit those other code gate breakers better. And then the other one I would say is like barriers are pretty much only allowed to end the run, and so having a tool that very efficiently breaks barriers means you can face check without that tool and then break them efficiently at no cost. Code gates get to do a lot more things. Code gates do end the run, but they can also do many, many other things. And so there's less of the power budget of code gates is in end the run. So having a thing that just breaks it cheaply is not the only point of power, and the high upfront install cost kind of means that you're not incentivized the learner to just slap the buzzsaw down as soon as you find it, which then means you're more likely to eat the code gate subroutines, which are going to impact your tempo more, which kind of helps us stay in that second and third stage of the game.
Exactly. And I think code gates are the weird ice within Netrunner. Like, we all, I think, have an understanding of what a code gate looks like, but it's actually really hard to describe or tell someone what it is. Here's the bullet points. This is what a code gate is in Netrunner. They're kind of just like, they can do some funky things. They might be able to move. They might be able to like switch themselves out. There's only these different kind of design things that you can do with code gates that make it so that it's easier for us to print a card that Buzzsaw is bad into, because it's easier to print a really high strength code gate that maybe is porous. Something maybe like a Cylindra that Buzzsaw is really bad at breaking. I believe it's 8 credits for Buzzsaw to break a Cylindra without additional support. But also, you don't need to. You just have to suffer the consequences of Cylindra. So I think Buzzsaw is definitely a card that can be similarly warping. I personally don't like that it frequently makes 3, 2, 1, and 0 cost code gates kind of very similar or flat, but it just does so to a degree that's less problematic than Cleaver. And I think all of these things that we're talking about, the degrees matter. So the degree to which something is credit efficient matters for if it is basically put something into flat game state or not. K2, 3, I'm not going to try it again. Turbine, if it boosted the strength by 1 of everything, still really good. Probably still a problem, but would at least help mitigate the degree to which it invalidated the strength of ice.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, Turbine was probably always going to be a format warping card, but at +2 it was so warping as to kind of make it difficult to play any Glaciary style strategy. Do you want to talk about Boomerang? I'm going to group Boomerang, Botchless as kind of a group of tools, and so these are contentious tools. I'd love to hear kind of why what you think differentiates these. I think we have good framework for it, but I want to throw it to you for it.
So Boomerang and Botulus, right? I think the scope of what they do is limited to a single piece of ice. And as a result, while they don't care about strength and they can work in their own different ways continuously, because the scope is limited to a single piece of ice, these things don't tend to warp game states as much as kind of the other cards. Due to their numbers and their power level, I think they are still incredibly relevant kind of faker tools. But these kind of incidental is not the right word. These kinds of keys that temporarily unlock a very specific lock that a runner was struggling with can actually be healthy for the game. It can actually make it so that you can, as the runner, interact with key specific agenda pushes or assets when you need to, but there's a cost to it. Botulus, against certain ice basically just says like you can delete the ice from the board, but it comes with an MU cost, and its install cost is also, I would say, meaningful as well. So both of these things I think are really strong, but if both of these cost one more credit to install or something, they might be barely playable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the last one I want, I maybe put this on the slides without us talking about it, but I think Matryoshka has seen a ton of play towards the tail end of the Continental Season since we're recording. And I think it's interesting to me where it's like, oh yeah, I think this card does start to toe some of these lines, right? Because it is a card that opens up every lock pretty much, pretty easily. But it does have some limitations that some of the other ones do. Some of the other cards don't. So like, while it does still care about your resources, it's a fairly efficient breaker, but it's not. You can usually find a more efficient, specific subtyped breaker. You also don't get card slots back because you still need to play 5 or 6 of these in a lot of cases. So one of the things we didn't really talk about is a lot of these faker tools give you slot efficiency in your deck, allow you to put more econ cards in, and you don't get those back with Matryoshka. And there is like a draw and sequencing thing with Matryoshka that's maybe a little bit more punishing because you need to find multiple copies. Though it's definitely a card that feels like it's towing the line of this exact current metagame, though it didn't feel like a problem at all in the previous one because of changes in the ice availability.
Yeah, I think that Matryoshka is such an interesting piece here. I think when we look at kind of what it is, it has a scope that is kind of broad, but then is also kind of limited based off of the number of dolls that you find, and the number of ice you need to interact with each turn. You can only basically break so many locks equal to the number of dolls that you've managed to find. I think that it is actually like a tool that helps with runner draw order, and I think that's part of the reason why we didn't necessarily see it as much before Elevation Standard, where we just had a lot more draw and economy options, which both helped with finding your specific, more efficient breakers, and then also basically runners were a lot better at creating flat game states at that time period. We had Bankar, we had Turbine, we had Cleaver.
I mean, yeah, we're not going to talk. We haven't talked about Amakua, but because it's not an NSG card, but that was like a big one as well.
Yeah. So, and I think Matryoshka, we look at the numbers now and we're like, oh, this does pretty well for like, it's pretty efficient. And it's like, these are corroder numbers. Now, corroder numbers were really efficient and were considered to be very good from the game's release to when I stepped away from the game in like 2016, 2017, right? Corroder was, before Paperclip, a very good fractor. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Matryoshka, is that the environment that we have right now with the lower card pool, with reduced power level, with reduced ice, like just less ice that runners have to be prepared for, means that like corroder numbers on this Matryoshka are actually like a pretty efficient way of dealing with ice, and then it helps solve other problems that runners currently run into, where finding specific breakers early on enough can actually be somewhat challenging for them. I think that it's closest actually to like maybe like a Bankar.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, like in the early game, you can kind of reliably count on finding 2 dolls, generally speaking. And so that means that you can basically interact with any single iced server. You can only just choose one per turn. And there's something to be said for the fact that a lot of the current corp strategies that are strong in the meta are relying on those like single iced servers.
Yeah.
So Matryoshka is like an interesting like push and pull, but I think it's maybe one of the not safer. It is one of the most appropriate, I guess, like AI pieces where it still requires resource and its scope kind of scales with like the game length.
Yeah. So yeah, in conclusion, like I hope this has been a kind of interesting way for people to start thinking about the game of Netrunner and the card design of Netrunner. So like, you know, we have this idea now of this flat game state where, yeah, the corp is unable, the way I think about this, the corp is unable to prevent the runner from doing what they want to do, which is generally accessing cards, right? And that to some extent, the basic action card, the core system of Netrunner actually creates this flat game state. And so it has to be the other cards and card types that move us away from this card state, or we should say, maybe even more say, corp cards has to push against this flat game state, and strong runner cards tend to try and return to that flat game state. And so the goal of the game design and kind of competitive balance is to try and never get back to that flat game state, but instead get to the stage of resource spending after this, you know, this lock and key phase of the game. And that ice and icebreakers are probably the most interesting and maybe even the most sensitive system to disrupting and kind of adjusting this flat game state. And that's why there's a lot of them on the ban list right now, and why it was kind of the core of this video.
So there are some things that we didn't touch on. Other kind of mechanisms within the game that you see frequently come up. So we're going to just run through each one of these, because these are not, when we think of icebreakers, ice and icebreakers, and we're thinking about how they resist flat game state, these are kind of parallel to flat game state. So of course there's an alternative way of winning. And frequently what we find is that when corps cannot prevent a flat game state from occurring, they will instead go to kind of kill game plans, because that is something that does allow them to still win the game, right? And then agendas either kind of help contribute to that combo kill thing, or in the worst examples is the corp is literally trying to just hide the agendas because those are the lose condition, and their win condition is not related to their lose condition at all. Nano management is a really interesting case where, you know, it allows the corp to basically break the typical pattern of needing to install an agenda on one turn and then on the following turn score it out, and also making it vulnerable to the runner. The other thing that fast advanced tools and nano management do is they're usually a way for rush-based corps or other scoring corps to basically try to duck under the runner's flat game state window. So before you reach phase 4, I'm going to score out 5 points, and then the game becomes flat, and the corp is saying, you know what, I have this 1 or 2 tools in my deck that allow me to go from 5 to 7 points, ignoring kind of a flat game state. And that's one of the reasons why I think nano management is kind of one of those classic cards that has always helped specific kinds of corporations that are focused on scoring kind of evade the flat game state runner dynamics.
Something we didn't talk about is like, as the corp, you can index into different elements of the game being of the four phases, like where you want to index more of your power, right? And one way the glacier decks tend to index for, okay, the game is eventually going to get to stage 4, and I'm going to be able to outgrind the runner's resources. So I'm going to ask them to have a more efficient engine than they're able to. And nano management is a tool that instead says, oh, more of my game is going to hinge on that stage 2, where I'm going to try and make the runner find all their keys as fast as possible. And then if they have, I have nano management as my back pocket because the game is somewhat reasonably balanced. If you're indexing heavily as the corp, if you're indexing power on stage 2, where you're trying to put lots of keys, they tend to not be very costly keys to continue to break.
And then, of course, lastly, you have defensive upgrades and just general defensive effects that we just didn't talk about as well. These also matter quite a bit, but they tend to matter the most when the game is still hinging on being an economic game.
Yeah.
So Managarm asks for the runner to have even more resources and kind of multiplies the effectiveness of the ice protecting it. In some cases, it acts as an ice by itself. And that's a very strong effect because it's like it's a lock that the runner can't use a key on and cannot determine the effectiveness. It just says, no, you must have 2 clicks or a raw 5 credits to get through me. And then, of course, you have other defensive agendas like Bologna or NAPD. Lockdown or contract is the one that I was thinking of, where it just says, runner, you need to have credits to actually, like, when you touch cards, you also need to have the credits to steal the agendas.
Yeah, and I think it's like, all of these adjust the flat game state, but they do it almost in this, especially the defensive upgrades and effects tend to do it kind of similarly to assets, where it's just like, how efficiently as the runner can you make credit resources? And that's why I think having that ice interplay is almost the preferred way to make the game more dynamic, and why we spent so much time on it in this video. But it would be disingenuous to say that if ice are bad, there's no other recourse for the corpse, and that like these are not part of both combo kill, combo scoring from hand, and defensive upgrades are not also a really important part of disrupting flat game state.
I have one other thing to add, and that is that I think the game is most interesting when you have kind of all of these things balanced and like effective together, and the games get to become more dynamic and interesting as a result, and people have access to kind of different strategies that they want to lean into and choose what buckets they want to dip into.
Safer, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for talking about this, introducing this to me, the other playtesters, design and dev team. I think it's very neat to feel like there's Netrunner theory being kind of introduced and talked about, and maybe some will point me to an article that this is actually a decade-old concept at this point, but it felt new to all of us involved. So hope you all find this interesting and that you've been enjoying the competitive season. This may or may not be out before the next ban list, depending on my editing time. So hopefully people will have some fun with that, and I will get to see a bunch of you at Worlds in probably just about a month when this video comes out. So thanks again, Safer.
Thanks for having me on, and shout out to Peter H.
Shout outs to Peter H.